Okay, so let's move on to our third general type of tissue, and that's going to be muscle tissue. We're going to learn a lot more about this when we hit the muscular system, but for now, I'm just going to give you basic differences between the three different types of muscle tissue that we have. Regardless of what type of muscle tissue it is, muscle tissue is highly vascularized, so it has huge amounts of blood supply. It needs a ton of nutrients in order to generate the amount of ATP or energy needed for these muscle cells to undergo contraction. So it's responsible for most types of movement. Muscle tissue is going to be made up of what we call myofilaments. So we have some thick filaments and thin filaments that are going to come together. The thin filaments made up of actin, the thick filaments made up of myosin, and that's what actually allows for muscle contraction. Like I just mentioned, we have three different types. So we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart. And we have smooth muscle, which is predominantly found in our organs. So like we have some smooth muscle in our blood vessels so that they can dilate and constrict. And we have smooth muscle even in like our stomach, things like that. So skeletal muscle is always going to be attached to bones because its whole purpose is to actually move our bones, so for locomotion itself. It is a type and the only type of voluntary muscle we have, meaning our somatic nervous system controls it. So we decide to move our skeletal muscle and cause contraction, which is why it's voluntary. The cells that make up skeletal muscle tissue are called fibers because they're very long. So for example, this is like one muscle cell right there. So because the muscle cells look like fibers, they're also referred to as muscle fibers. Again, we're going to need tons of mitochondria and multiple nuclei in our skeletal muscle cells because they have to generate so many proteins and so much energy in order for us to have movement within our body. And they also appear striated or banded. So we see these bands that look like light bands and dark bands. Let me show you right here. We can see a dark band right there, and then adjacent to it's a lighter band. This dark and light band alternation is what we call striated because it looks like it has striations. And again, you'll learn why it's striated when we hit the skeletal muscle system. But again, just kind of understand that we're talking about skeletal muscle. That's going to be the muscle that's attached to our bones, sometimes our skin, and it allows for our actual movement. Multiple nuclei, and they form the fibers, and we have striations in them. Cardiac muscle. This muscle tissue is only found in the walls of our heart. It's involuntary, so it belongs to our autonomic nervous system. We do not have control over cardiac muscle or smooth muscle contraction, so they're both involuntary. However, we can influence their rate. So if we get into, for example, an event where we're in anxious, high stress, something like that, we can influence the rate of our cardiac muscle contraction based off of that. But other than that, we cannot initiate their contraction. We can just speed it up or slow it down based on our environment. Like skeletal muscle, it also has those bands, so dark and light bands called striations. But instead of having multiple nuclei, cardiac muscle typically only have one nucleus. The cardiac cells are much shorter, so we don't have these long, huge extensions. So because they're much shorter and because we have to make up our entire heart, we actually have to connect these cardiac muscles. Where they connect is a little bit darker, especially under a microscope. And what that darker region is where they're connecting is called an intercalated disc. So it's a special type of joint between all the cardiac muscle cells. And in these joints, you can find things like desmosomes that help them resist the tension between the different cells as the heart is undergoing contraction and relaxation. So this is what it looks like. Here's one of the connections between two of our cardiac cells. Those are the intercalated disc. Also, it does have some branching that I forgot to mention. So it has branching. We still have striations like our cardiac muscle, but unlike our cardiac muscle, it's uninucleate, so it only has one nucleus. We have multiple when we're talking about our skeletal muscle system. Where is it found? Only in our heart. Smooth muscle, again, it's going to be found in the walls of hollow organs. So, say our alimentary canal, our digestive system, as well as our blood vessels, even our stomach, something like that. It's also involuntary. We cannot tell our stomach, our blood vessels to contract. However, we can influence their contraction based on our environment. There are not any striations in it, so we don't see those bandings, the dark and the light bands, which is why it's called smooth muscle, because it looks like it's all one color. They are typically spindle shaped, so they kind of look like this, and I'm a terrible drawer. They have one nucleus or a uninucleate, just like our cardiac muscle. So here's the spindle shape. They kind of look like they're fibers here, but in reality, this is like one smooth muscle cell. We have another one that's kind of gonna go like this. Not really. Oh, here's a better cartoon image of that right there. Again, this is going to be the muscle that's in the walls of all of our hollow organs.